You're listening to episode 381.
Welcome to Transforming Missions Podcast. I'm Sara.
And I'm Tim, and we thank you for joining us today.
Today we're talking about expanding your leadership neighborhood. We're looking at Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus from Luke 16.
Yeah, this isn't a story about money, even though it mentions money. It's a story about seeing and responding to the people at the edges of our leadership circles. And Sara, why don't you start reading it for us, and when you stop, I'll take over.
That sounds like a Tim statement. Okay, so here is starting with verse 19. There was a certain rich man who clothed himself in purple and fine linen, and who feasted luxuriously every day. At his gate lay a certain poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. Lazarus longed to eat the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Instead, dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried by angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. While being tormented in the place of the dead, he looked up and saw Abraham at a distance with Lazarus at his side. He shouted, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm suffering in this flame." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received good things, whereas Lazarus received terrible things. Now Lazarus is being comforted, and you are in great pain."
Moreover, a great crevice had been fixed between us and you, and those who wish to cross over from here to you cannot. Neither can anyone cross from there to us. The rich man said, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house. I have 5 brothers. He needs to warn them so that they don't come to this place of agony." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They must listen to them." The rich man said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they'll change their hearts and lives." And Abraham said, "If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, then neither will they be persuaded if someone rises from the dead." That ending is a great ending for a parable. There's a reversal, a great chasm and a sobering warning. But I like the way parables twist things at the end to have us thinking.
And there's not a small amount in that parable. And I just go back to the very beginning of the parable. You've got this rich man and Lazarus, 2 contrasting realities. And why didn't the rich man notice Lazarus? Why didn't he act while he had a chance? Why wasn't there a response?
Yeah, Sara, that makes me ask, initially on the surface, who's at my gate? Who am I not seeing? Am I so focused on the inside of my world that I've stopped looking at the margins?
And those are all good questions to sit with. So go ahead, say more.
I'm just thinking about, as I begin to think about who's at my gate, I begin to think about how big is my neighborhood as part of what I begin to think about. So it's not always how many people are at the gate, but how big is the gate, and what kind of responsibility do I have with the people at the gate? Those are things I begin to ask.
I think there's also some questions for leaders that come out of this as well, in terms of thinking about our ministries and our organizations. Do we unintentionally create gates? Are we keeping some people outside instead of drawing them in?
Now who's meddling?
We'll just call this the meddling podcast. And so if we're going to look at the scripture, it's speaking to us, inviting us to explore something. And in the world today, I think it's important that the church speaks up and embodies care for anyone who's being pushed to the margins. especially in the time that we're living in. We do create gates, and we need to raise awareness of where those gates are present. And this is going to sound silly, but the parking lot in the church that we're opening in just a couple of weeks, it might even be open by the time you listen to this. The traffic pattern is off, odd. They tried to move the parking spaces so that people would not cut through the parking lot from one major road to another major road. But what it's done instead is we have a portico, and so what has happened is between 2 and 4 p.m., and you can guess what's happening at 2 and 4 p.m. if you've heard me say that we sit right across from schools, and so school is letting out, and it's become a safety issue because people are flying under the portico, and last week we had someone almost get hit. We've also had cars almost crash into one another because one's coming from one direction and one is coming from the opposite direction, and they're going so fast and they can't see one another. So we start talking about, what do we do? Do we put cones up? They're going to hit the cones. Do we put a chain up? They're going to hit the chain. Do we put a sign up? They're not going to read the sign. Do we try and block out the people that the reality is we're intentionally trying to reach? And so it's literal and figurative gates don't build relationships. And at the very same time, keeping everyone safe is important. And so it begs for me the question of, gates serve a purpose, but what is their purpose?
Yeah, you got me thinking, whether it's literal or figurative gates, they're both problems. So here's another one. What chasms exist in our churches and in our communities right now that we're pretending aren't there, that we're just rushing through and putting other people at risk?
So what chasm might you be referring to? We're living in a time of, if I can say it this way, deep division, politically, economically, socially. And so it's easy to retreat into our echo chambers and only see and hear the people who look and think and talk and have opinions like us.
You're right. And the parable, I think, challenges us to resist that. It reflects back to us a reality that if we're listening to the parable, we recognize Lazarus and all of his buddies at the gate before the chasm becomes unbridgeable, to act now and not someday. And Sarah, it in my mind, the thing that came to mind when I read this, and we've talked about it, is how big is our responsibility? Is it just for people at the gate? Or does the, if I may use the word neighborhood, does the neighborhood get bigger? And maybe that chasm gets bigger as our neighborhood or gets smaller. Maybe that chasm gets bigger when we don't recognize the people at the gate. It's part of our response at the people at the gate that the chasm does not get any bigger than it is. Now, we were talking about those things about the day in which we live. One of the things that's driving me crazy right now is, how in the world does the church respond to the numbers of people being pushed outside the gate? Now, that's a different thing than the parable, but that's just part of the struggle I'm going through when I read the parable and the numbers of people at the gate and the divide that we've created. So thanks for being my therapist for a moment.
And I think that's why I don't know that I ever got really past the beginning of this parable, because it sets up the fact that there is a gate, an intentional gate to separate a certain rich man and someone who had needs. I'll say it that way. And was that intentional? Do we try to explain it away of, oh, that was just society at that time? Or is it reflecting to us the reality of, this is our human nature? and this is not what God's nature is.
I think, from my perspective, I think your second one there is exactly what it is. And so the parable doesn't tell us that rich people are terrible people. It's telling us. I've heard people preach on it that way. It doesn't tell us that people who have, that there's something wrong with them, and the people that have not are more important. What it reflects back to us is exactly what you said. The reality is that we reach a place, and not only in our society, but in our lives, where we are comfortable, because that's the culture in which we live in, and that we're comfortable, and so comfortable that we don't see the people who are at those proverbial gates, unless they're people like us to keep asking them to look for them.
And so part of what this parable is inviting us to do is to acknowledge what our human tendencies are.
Right.
And
exactly.
And to respond differently, because as followers of Jesus, we are invited to respond differently and to recognize in every person that we encounter is the image of God.
Hopefully we can have our leaders think that way. I had a friend, I guess he's still a friend, so he's still around, that was in Houston, who lived in a gated community. And one of the things he used to say was, it's really hard to preach the gospel when you know the gate's closing behind you.
I live in a gated community too, but my gates never close.
Maybe yours is more gospel oriented then.
Someone decided at some point in time the gates didn't need to close. So, Tim, I'm wondering if, and I'm not going to ask this the way that I want to ask it, but is there a time that you can think of when you realize that either there was a Lazarus at your gate, someone that you were overlooking until God got your attention, or a situation or circumstance happening today that you want to call to light in light of this parable?
Sarah, I'm a slow learner, so just about every place that I've been in ministry, geographic places that I've been, there's always somebody that I have overlooked that have helped me become more who I'm supposed to be. I can remember in one church, we not only fed people on a regular basis, found homes for them, but we also had an HIV/AIDS ministry. And I got to tell you that when we first started that ministry, although I'd worked hard with the HIV/AIDS clinic to get it started, I'm going to say it this way, I was afraid to go to meet the people because of all the stereotypes I had of the people who'd be coming.
Well, and what we understood and knew about HIV/AIDS, or didn't understand, I guess is probably the better way to say it, about HIV/AIDS at that point in time in history.
There were two people particularly who came, and I'm going to say they actually came to the gate and were invited in, because at that little ministry we had, people were invited in to sit at a table. I had people that would talk with them, serve them coffee and cookies or whatever. And one gentleman who came and began to tell his story, he came several times, but I got to tell you, the chasm, the division was big for me because I was afraid. I'll name that. I was afraid.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt your story. Isn't that why we erect gates?
Sure. Thanks for doing that. I was making an assumption.
I mean, we put up gates because there is a fear of something.
Right. He came and he'd have coffee. He wasn't a young guy, but he wasn't old like I am now. And his story was that he had a blood transfusion several years before, and he had become HIV positive. with that blood transfusion. And because there was no way to care for it at that point, he went into AIDS. I'm not going to say the church that he went to, but he went to the leader of the church, pastor, priest, and told him what his situation was. And the pastor, priest said, I don't know how we can care for you here. You'll need to find someplace else. And he had not found a church or anything until the clinic said, you can pick up some things that you want to at First United Methodist Church. They made a list of the things he needed, and he came to the church with his list. And it didn't make any difference. Of course, you've heard me tell the story that it was an old bank building that we had. The lobby was the place where we met people. And my joke was always the vault is where we kept the Tide and the toothpaste. And so he came and to get his Tide and toothpaste and whatever else it might have been. And when he sat at the table and actually told his story and people listened, and even though we weren't supposed to pray, what I remember of that, and this is how the division closed for me, it began to bridge the gap. And that was, this is the first time anybody has listened to the place where I felt like they cared. It would be maybe several months later that he talked about whether to be a part of the church or not or whatever. But it was several months later he became ill and he was in the hospital. We never knew the names of people unless they came and told us their names. We didn't even know he was in the hospital until he asked if someone would just come and pray with him. That would be a Lazarus moment for me. There would have always been a gap if I had not been invited in, not only by him, but by the people who had already gotten to the gate long before I did and said, you need to come and meet this guy. And it wasn't coming because I was the pastor. They were asking me to come and meet him because they met Jesus in him. So yes. My question is, and I don't want to get us off the track of what we're doing, and eventually I'll get back to it if it's not the right time. But my question is, how far down the road do we go to care for people? Because I think the bigger the gap, the smaller our neighborhood. If our neighborhood expands, the gap gets smaller. So how far down the road do we go? Stop me, Sarah. Get on. Let's go on with this podcast.
No, what I'm going back to my silly parking lot situation of not wanting people to get hurt and yet erecting gates. And how do you, to use your language, how do you expand the neighborhood while caring for all? It's a delicate balance sometimes.
Right.
And we've talked about this probably 100 episodes ago. There's not a quick fix when you're talking about human relationship and people in situations in different relationships. In different situations, it gets complicated real quick.
And I think a word that we've used is it's messy.
And yet, how messy was it to offer the care that you described? It's really pretty simple.
It's simple, but here's one of the things that
it's simple, but not
a few episodes ago, and that is perfect love casts out fear. I'm hearing Jesus around a campfire, if I can say it that way, with his disciples and saying, I know you all don't agree. And I know that it's tough to get along with each other, but I want you to love one another the way I've loved you. And if we do that, just doing that with where we're afraid, if we just love people the way we've been loved in the midst of our fears, the chasm gets smaller. The gate comes down.
And so, yeah, and so you weren't asking to answer your question, how far do we go? But I'm thinking of what I've heard you say often. You know, you've cared for that one gentleman. Next, it's who's the next person that you're going to encounter, and then the next person, and then the next person, and however you keep going, because if the love of God that we know in Jesus is what is motivating you and is what is guiding you, there is no.
And that gets scary too. There's another divide to cross at that point. I'm sitting here thinking about how big is the neighborhood, and these things never crossed my mind when I was a district superintendent there in West Ohio. But now that I'm in West Virginia and in the southern coal fields, they don't have clean water to drink.
Right.
And there are nights that
it's wrong,
I'm
but
thinking,
right.
There are nights that I go to bed thinking, how can I know that and not do something about it? And
Yeah.
is that part of my responsibility? Is that part of my neighborhood? And I can say, oh no, that's the southern coal fields in West Virginia. I'm up here in Charleston. I can be the rich man.
Well, and my example isn't anywhere near as poignant as that, and it sounds self-serving, but what I'm thinking about is the way that we have ordered society. We set up those barriers. So for the past, now 10 years, I have lived in places where I'm right on a county line. And I'm in one of those places again. And this is funny now. It wasn't funny at the moment. We had a festival that we were supposed to be doing on Saturday. Everything for the festival was in my garage. My car was parked in my garage with all of the belongings, and I could not get my garage door open. Only entry is through the garage door. Went to the festival to tell the person that was heading this up, then we were not going to be able to have our booth because everything was stuck in my garage. And his first question was, do you live in Mason? And I knew exactly where he was going. He was going to send one of his firefighter friends to get my garage door open so that we could be there. But guess what? I don't live in Mason. I live in Liberty Township. And that's not his jurisdiction. So he couldn't send anybody, even though he was the deputy chief of the fire department of the city. It's not his jurisdiction. I mean, I say that, it's a silly example, but we set up those gates. And so, Charleston to the coal fields, or one county to the next, we get conditioned that, well, that's the line and we don't cross it. And Jesus says, what line?
Exactly.
Someone needs help, you go. You find out about a situation where there's not the basic needs of humans are not being met, you respond. You might not be able to care about all of it or for all of it, but what part can you do? And what I'm always surprised by, and this will probably me than I wanted to say, but you take that first step, and what always ends up happening? There's more, and then there's more, and then there's more. And it's not all left up to you, because other people come along and other people learn about what's happening, and they offer their part. And together, now we're talking loaves and fishes, right? We'll jump to a completely different parable. But we get so conditioned in the world that we live in that, well, this is we don't cross that.
You got me thinking.
And Jesus is saying to us, no, what line? I don't see a gate. All I see is another human being.
Thank you for that. That's Sarah's wisdom. I think that's exactly right. And that's the reason that I always say it matters where you start. Because if you start with Jesus, there are no lines. If you start someplace else, it doesn't make any difference where you start. We're limited. It's only the love of God that's unlimited.
Right.
And maybe that's what creates the artificial barriers or protects us from that which we don't know or of which we're afraid. I just keep going back to the idea if we love the way we've been loved, then we can get beyond the barriers and the lines that we've drawn. And yep.
So, with all of that in mind, how can Christ-centered leaders respond this week to what we've been?
I think just off the top of my head, quickly, name the Lazarus in your context. And then cross the gate or open the gate or be intentional about it. And then use your influence or be a steward of the influence you have to amplify voices at the margins. Help people. I mean, sometimes maybe the best way we open the gate or take advantage of people who are at the gate is to be a voice for them, because one of the reasons they're at the gate is that no one's listening. Or we help people see who's there, because one of the reasons they're at the gate is that we're not paying attention to them. So it's just drawing attention, getting a voice heard. Sometimes it's being an advocate for them. A little conversation we're in right now at the church where I am, and it's a good conversation. They used to feed people every Wednesday night that would come in off the street, and it was for everybody, but people could come in off the street, and they had a little incident, and we stopped doing that. Now it's another Methodist church in town that's going to start feeding people breakfast, and they've asked us if we want to participate in that. And we've not made it a big conversation. It's just in my mind now. And that is, this is me. If we can't feed them at our place, how are we going to go to somebody else's place to feed them? That's just in my mind. And that will be my chasm. And I'll have to find a way to bridge that, because as the neighborhood gets bigger, that'll get smaller. That makes sense?
Oh, yes, it makes perfect sense. And what I'm thinking is, and maybe this is a question for you to sit with this week. The question is, what chasm is God calling you to cross? Who is at your gate waiting to be seen and welcomed? And if that question is guiding your prayers and your decisions and your conversation this week, where might God lead you? Anything you want to add to that, Tim?
We've done a lot of talking about who's at the gate. I heard this story recently, and it keeps jumping out and wants me to tell it, so I'm going to tell it. I think everybody who's a baseball fan knows the name Jackie Robinson. He was the first African American to play in the major leagues, and he came from the South, and he was coming to Brooklyn, playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers. I don't remember the general manager at that time of the Brooklyn Dodgers, but he was a Methodist. And so part of his background was recognizing people at the gate. And at that time, in the late 40s and early 50s, we were leaving a lot of people of color at the gate. We weren't paying attention. Jackie, when he came to play for the Dodgers, was married and had two children. They lived in a small house that they were able to get in a certain neighborhood, and they had a third baby, and they needed a larger house. But because of the time that we lived in this country, no one would sell them a house. And so there was I'm not sure what newspaper or magazine wanted to interview Jackie's wife. I think her name was Andrea. Wanted to interview her about her house hunting because they knew that there was a problem. And so she told the story about them looking for a house. There was a man by the name of Simon who had a partner, Schuster. They were publishers, and that story got back, and maybe it wasn't Jackie's wife who's Andrea, maybe it was Mr. Simon's wife whose name was Andrea. Somebody was named Andrea. But she picked up on the story and invited Jackie's wife to come and visit her. And I think that was in Sanford, Connecticut. She took her around and they looked for houses, identified a place where they could build a house. Mrs. Simon also got the clergy together and got people in the Sanford area to begin to become more racially sensitive in the community. When they identified a place for Jackie and his family, the house wouldn't be complete for over a year. So the Simon family invited them to stay at their house. Now, one of the children in that family was named Carly. So Carly Simon became one of Jackie Robinson's great fans, and Jackie took her to the ballpark with him, and she became an unofficial mascot and grew up with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And then when the house was complete, they moved, the Robinsons moved out of the Simons' house into their own house, but they all remained really close friends until everybody dies. But the reason I tell that story is the gate was pretty big at that time. And there was somebody who did notice. And when they noticed, the divide closed pretty quickly. I think the reason I like that story, because I like baseball, but I think the reason I like that story is that as much as we think that doesn't happen, it's happening much more today than it's happened in recent years. And we as leaders in the church have an opportunity to be able to raise the consciousness, to raise the view, to raise the acoustics to the place where we begin to understand who's at the gate and how we might respond to those persons. I think that's what this parable is about. Because I always ask the question, and it gets me in trouble, but I always ask the question, is that how far down the street do I go? Do I go to another town? Do I go to another country? And if there are people somewhere else who are responsible for caring for people, does that relieve me of my responsibility? I know that we'll take care of starving people on our own doorstep, but how far do we go? And Sarah, you've already answered that for today, because if we're followers of Jesus, we go as far as we need to. So thanks for creating a whole lot of stuff in my mind today. It's all good. Thank you. And thank you for listening to episode 381. As always, your notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/381. Tim, will you send us out with a benediction? And let me just say, how have I never heard that story? Let me do the benediction, then I'll tell you. When you leave this podcast, you're going into the mission field where people need a kind, caring, supportive, encouraging word. And God's already put that word in you through Jesus. The joy and peace of this life comes in sharing what you've received. So go in peace to experience the joy. In the name of the living God who loves you in Jesus and who's empowered you to see and to hear and respond to the people at the gate by the Holy Spirit. Amen.